Open Market is sponsored by AdLib, the self-serve DSP solution making advertising easy. What do the world's largest demand-side platforms have in common? They're effective, but they require large annual contracts and spend minimums. With AdLib, growing agencies get a single platform that connects to every top global DSP with no contracts, no spend minimums, and G2's #1 ranked support. That means access to the entire universe of TV, digital out-of-home, audio, display, video, and native without a hassle and with no blind spots. It's incredibly easy to use, plus it can automate most of the work your team spends hours a day doing manually. Get the most powerful media buying technology without the barriers to entry. Check out AdLib at getadlib.com today.
Welcome to Open Market, a podcast about building companies in the advertising industry. I'm Joe Zappa, and I'm joined by Eric Franchi and illustrious guest Michael Katz. How are you?
Hey, Joe. Hey, Michael. How are we doing?
Good. Yeah, excited to be on here with you guys.
So for those who are not familiar with Michael Katz, brief background, Mike and I go way back. He was originally the founder and CEO of Interclick, which was a data-driven ad network, very much ahead of its time. Fair?
Very fair.
Yeah, very much ahead of its time with respect to data. It was acquired by Yahoo probably 12 years ago for $270 million.
Correct.
After that, Michael launched what basically established the CDP category with mParticle. I'm lucky enough to be a personal investor in mParticle. mParticle helps like the most amazing brands in the world use their customer data and AI to just deliver like great experiences, marketing, service, all that stuff. Accurate?
Yeah.
Good. Awesome. All right. So earlier this week, or last week, whatever it was, Paul Graham from Y Combinator dropped this very short blog post on founder mode. And it was fairly high level. Didn't really actually kind of talk about too much, but for whatever reason, it went viral and people were like fired up and there were all sorts of takes. And because this is a podcast about building businesses and, with a focus on like ad tech and advertising and marketing, we wanted to do something. And then, in the midst of like us talking about it, Michael dropped what was a much better and frankly epic blog post that everybody should read. It's titled False Prophets and False Proxies, which is really about his experience with one of the key areas of founder mode and key issues of founder mode, which is hiring. So what we wanted to do is bring Michael on and just like have a conversation about this because like so much of our audience are founders and CEOs and execs that I think this will resonate really well with them. Before we do it, Joe, can you just like tell the audience, for those who didn't read it, like what the hell is founder mode?
Yeah, Paul Graham's essay was inspired by a talk that Brian Chesky gave at a Y Combinator event. Graham essentially says that there's founder mode and then there's manager mode. And manager mode is the playbook most people are familiar with for scaling a company. It's basically the advice of you hire good people and you let them operate and you don't micromanage. And he contrasts this with founder mode, where he says founders have essentially been gaslit into following that managerial scale playbook. And he only gives two examples of what founder mode would entail. He says, for example, that it would involve more skip-level meetings. So in other words, the founder is more involved with the people who are actually doing the work, not just delegating to an executive team. And then he also uses as an example a Steve Jobs practice, which was to get together the 100 most important people at Apple. And he mentions that these people, crucially, aren't necessarily the 100 most senior people at Apple. It's the 100 people, Jobs viewed as most important. So you can sort of get a sense for what founder mode might entail based on that. But I think there's an obvious complexity here, which is that at a certain level of scale, of course, you're going to delegate some important things as the founder, and you're going to have to hire people and trust them. So then in terms of actually operationalizing something we might call founder mode, it does become a question of how do you hire those people and how do you work with them? Because you're not going to do all of it totally solo. And that's what I thought was really smart and specific about Michael's posts. So Michael, why don't you tell us about your reaction to the founder mode idea?
Yeah, well, I do want to go on record and say Paul Graham is a total shitbag. So again, like I am not endorsing that guy at all. This is really
to be clear.
Yeah, just to be 100% clear. And this is more about my experience and also like my agreement with Brian Chesky. I think it can be framed in a number of ways. You have like founder mode versus manager mode. You have like wartime CEO versus like peacetime CEO. It kind of just comes down to the fact that like the founder, usually the founder CEO persona, like we're usually like forces of nature. Like we impose our will to kind of bend reality to make the things that we want happen. And sometimes that means violating what would probably be considered at like bigger companies to be like standard chain of command and protocols, right? One of the things that I really liked that Frank Slootman would advocate for at Snowflake was like go direct. You don't have to run things up the flagpole all the way to like your functional lead and have them talk to another functional lead and then have it go all the way back down. That's super inefficient. If you have something that you need to discuss or address with somebody who's on a different team at any level, go direct. So that's something that I try to promote a lot. And it's like, it's definitely a bit of a double-edged sword, right? Because sometimes you have people who are like, okay, this other person is overstepping their bounds. They're crossing into too many lanes. I don't like the way that feels. And I understand that. But at the same time, the delicate balance is like inside a startup, nothing is somebody else's problem. If you see something that's wrong, don't assume that somebody else is going to fix it for you. Like probably assume the opposite. Assume that if you don't do it, it's not going to get done. So these situations are really nuanced, but I would say like ultimately what it means is not worrying about corporate or organizational norms that may slow you down or create friction or inhibit you ultimately getting the thing done that you need to get done.
Makes sense. Before we dig deeper into, kind of your thinking around the key area, right, which is like exec hiring, why do you guys think this resonated so much, this post?
Well, I think it was very divisive. And I think like it created two very opposing viewpoints. I think every founder that I know was like, fuck yeah. Like I knew I wasn't an asshole. Like I knew that this is how it really worked. Because I do agree, like we have been gaslit by investors and conventional business wisdom where it's like you go and hire the seasoned executive and let the grown-ups take over, right? And I've done this. Like I've brought people in that have like far more decorated resumes than I will ever have, and they're way better middle managers than I will ever be or even want to be. And so it's kind of like put them in place and everything will kind of magically, like all the problems will magically disappear because they know everything. And the fact is most of the time they actually don't know everything. And I think that experience and I think the call out of that has evoked like such a visceral reaction from the founder community where it's like, yes, like I've had that, like that experience happens a lot across all kind of industry. This isn't just like an ad or marketing tech thing. This is kind of everywhere. And then I think on the flip side, you have the people who aren't founders who are like, wait, are you attacking me? What about like the founders aren't perfect either. I was set up to fail from the get-go. And so I think you created like these like two kind of tropical storms that were like, on a collision course with each other. And I think the total perception was like, yeah, this thing caught viral fire.
That makes a ton of sense. Joe, what do you think?
Yeah, it's interesting, Michael, that you use the phrase go direct because I use that phrase all the time. And to me, it means two things in the context of marketing, which is my domain. One is, that the CEO and or founder goes direct to their audience. So they're not depending on third-party gatekeepers, i.e. they're posting their own stuff, on social or writing their own newsletter or whatever instead of relying on journalists to amplify their message. But the other piece of going direct and the reason the founder mode essay resonated so much with me is that it's also saying to founders and or CEOs, you take over the marketing function and you use your probably unparalleled knowledge of the ecosystem and the company to influence customers and the people who influence them. So when I see, like, I work with, some founders who have 30-person marketing teams and some founders who have no marketing team. There are advantages to having a big team and they produce a lot of valuable work, but messages absolutely do get watered down in those environments, right? Like when you have like big teams, like the main thing, like marketing and legal people are going to tell you is like, don't say that. Anything that's provocative, right? Like even when you're like calling Paul Graham a shitbag, well, guess what? Marketers and legal people, that makes them very uncomfortable. They do not like that.
Yeah, totally.
And so I think that's a big part of it is like part of founders, this essay resonating so much with them is that like they know they have a lot of ideas and they know how to talk to their audience, and like organizations are sort of built to prevent that attitude of like risk-taking boldness and directness. But to give some credence to the other side, I also get that, non-founders have a lot of value to add to companies and that they are afraid that this sort of manifesto for founder mode will just lead to founders micromanaging the shit out of people, not trusting anyone. And as you said, Michael, setting them up to fail and then blaming them for it. And there is value there. Like this could be misused by other side.
Yeah, and there was a call out too, I think, towards the end of the post where he's like, this idea of founder mode, like it can easily be bastardized or weaponized, right? Like people, and it's not even just the founders taking on these like micro managey type like work styles. It can be weaponized by managers too. And so I think like my initial reaction is like, yeah, there is a lot of truth here, but let's address the kind of deeper rooted issues that happen maybe a little bit further upstream, because not all these managers who like don't work out at whatever organization, like they're never like really bad people. I mean, the vast majority of them are not like, it's not a nefarious thing. It's just like, it wasn't right for the time or the place. It wasn't the right, as I call out, it wasn't the right context for that type of hire. And culturally, even if the timing was right, they may not have been a cultural fit.
Yeah, this makes a ton of sense, and I have like experiences in my mind, playing out. Yeah, yeah, for sure. So we're told as founders, particularly, I think you nailed it. Like once, you may have investors and other folks around the table to hire people from big companies, hire people, who have brand names on their resumes, hire people that have done things at scale, and we've all done that, and it's never like 100% success rate. What have you learned about that over the years, and how have you gotten better? And you have this framework that you talked about in your post that sounds like it's a very good one for thinking this through.
Yeah, well, I'll just remind everybody, I think the reason that I was able to write halfway intelligently about this topic is because I've screwed up so many times. Like, and I probably continue,
That's why everybody respects you. Like you've been writing about your mistakes for 10 years. I mean, you go to Michael's Medium. It's 10 years of like very reflecting, thoughtful posts. And I think that gives you more fans than anything else.
Just as an aside, I think it's important to recognize that like, we're all human. We're all going to make mistakes. Nobody's perfect. Like the only kind of real bad mistakes are the ones that we don't learn from ultimately, right? Because I also think like if you're not making mistakes, you're probably playing it like a little bit too safe, and that doesn't work when you're trying to grow a startup. I think like there is this weird, and this speaks to like the false proxy thing, this weird sensationalism around like, oh, they hired this big company executive. They must be crushing it. That big company person, they must know something nobody else knows. And like, that's and I get that, like we've had those types of hires here, and our investors love it. Our employees get excited. Even our customers get excited. And, I think not to say that they can't work out. I think like many times, like there's a number of situations where you bring in the big company executive and they've had like transformative effects on smaller companies, right? I think like Sheryl Sandberg, when she went to Facebook, leaving Google, like I would argue most of their commercial success is directly attributed to her and her hire, right? So like these things can work out, and they can work out really well. It's not like the situation that's dead on arrival. But, you know, the other set of like false proxies is the kind of standard type of like hiring requirements. Like what other companies do they work at? Do they have like relevant experience? How big of a name do they have? But then there's also more subtle ones too. Like, again, we're all human. We all have biases and kind of tendencies to overweight or underweight certain things. Like people who are more eloquent are usually thought of more highly, right? Whereas like if you kind of like stumble over your words a little bit, or it takes you a little bit longer to formulate your views, I think like those folks are typically discounted implicitly, right? Or, you know, I think it's also kind of fair for folks to be judged on personal appearance. Like if you show up wearing pajamas to an interview, I think you're gonna get dinged. But does that mean that they can't do the job? It may mean that they're not a good cultural fit, right? But does that mean they can't do the job? No, it's just not a good proxy. So those are like, you know, those are some of the just like the high level lessons that I wanted to share and provide a framework for thinking about it in a much more productive way, which is like you have to take into account context, and you have to take into account like whatever the cultural norms are they going to fit in, or is the organizational like antibodies going to reject them? I've seen that happen a ton. And, you know, I've also seen, just kind of switch back and forth, like if the context isn't right, one of the things I called out is like, if you're in build mode and you hire somebody who's in scale mode and they're scaling broken systems, you can scale all you want. You're still not going to be successful, right? And I think like, admittedly, there's been times where like we've fallen into that trap. So like that's one that like I've seen very much firsthand. It's like, before we talk about scaling this thing, we got to fix it, because the gears are not properly turning. We are not seeing the outcomes, even at a small scale, that we want to see. So if we're seeing poor outcomes, why are we trying to scale that? Like that just doesn't work. So I think making sure that you're delineating between, and this is, I think, where the kind of founder mode, manager mode, it's almost more like builder mode and scaler mode. And build mode is really hard because you're starting with a totally blank canvas, and you're trying to connect systems, and you're trying to connect the dots. Like when Henry Ford created the assembly line, the concept of creating the assembly line is a lot harder than being a worker on the assembly line, right? And that's what I think is kind of implied in the post. It's like, figure out where you are. Like if the assembly line is already built, go and hire the best person to work on the assembly line, right? But if it's not built, you can't just assume because somebody's worked on an assembly line, they can build the assembly line. It's very different.
So I think, Michael, that your advice could be boiled down to a couple things. Well, one is I love this idea of build mode and then scale mode as opposed to just founder and manager mode, because it reflects that you as a founder will evolve and the types of people you hire will evolve as time goes on. So it's not just necessarily a question of like one disposition that lasts forever. And then the other piece is that like what matters when you're making these hires, which you ultimately will, of course, have to make, is a combination of culture and context, or, you know, proxies. And you're saying like one of the biggest context, or one of the biggest proxies or contextual indicators that people tend to look to, is the size of the org someone's coming from or their experience. Like you always want, the prototypical thing is you always want someone who's done the exact thing before, right? Like they've been where you want to get to, but that doesn't work. Eric, you're shaking your head. Why doesn't that work? Or what's your experience with that?
Yeah, but some of the biggest mistakes that I can recall making from a hiring perspective is just that, like, oh, this person had the job at, you know, insert competitor name. They're going to do great here, and they did, you know, great over there. They're just going to bring over like whatever expertise, book of business, or whatever it is. And I can just think back, and I would rank those as some of the worst hires I ever made. And again, just I'll take the responsibility for it.
There's also like strong sentiments of like adverse selection, right? Like yes, this person was at this highly successful company, one were they actually responsible for creating a lot of that success? Usually not, right? We see this a lot with like, I'm probably going to get a bunch of hate mail, but like people who come from Google these days, it's like they think they're like the greatest thing to hit the job market. It's like you had absolutely nothing to do with Google's success, right? And on top of that, it's like, if you were so great at this company, why are they letting you go?
That's a very good question. Yeah, for sure. Yeah, we could have a whole conversation about hiring from, companies like that. Dive into context. So if it's not, the brand name of where they worked previously, like what are some of those things that you look for and that you could point to as being like, sides that you hired well on the subject of context?
Yeah. Well, so I think like Joe, when I was talking about like context and culture, like build mode versus scale mode is like, that's kind of the crux of the context. And so, yeah, I can give you like a couple maybe specific examples. For a while, we wanted to hire people from like industry leading software companies like Okta and Salesforce and a number of others. Like that is the gold standard of company building and salesmanship and sales go-to-market excellence. Like we want to bring these people in. And what we've found, not every time, but a bunch of times, is like when you're used to selling at like the market leader, things are a lot easier than when you're trying to execute like the challenger sell. If you're the number 2 or number 3 in the space, you actually have to fight to overcome the number 1 because the number 1 has like the brand equity. It's like they become the safe choice. Everybody wants to work with them because nobody's going to get fired. For the folks that are selling against that and selling against that successfully, take that all day because like it is easy for sellers to get really complacent where it's like, okay, I got this massive lead generation machine behind me because of the brand equity that the company that I work at has. And if that goes away, can they still be successful? We've seen it very much hit or miss. I think another thing, and it kind of speaks to the same thing, but like have people sold in kind of pre-chasm market opportunities, like crossing the chasm, Jeffrey Moore's kind of concept where like all technology markets kind of move from visionaries and early adopters, then there's like this big drop off the chasm before it gets into like the mainstream. And selling in kind of pre-chasm environments is a lot different than selling in kind of post-chasm, like established markets. Like at InterClick, we were, one of 400 ad networks, right? Or like whatever the number was back in the day. I think like, both you guys at Undertone and us, like we were probably the 2 least capitalized companies in the space. Like we were both bootstrapped, almost entirely from the origin. But there was this established market, right? It had, by 2006, it had gone from like early adopters of ad networks to like mainstream. Ad networks were on like every single media buy. Fast forward to mParticle. When we started, like there was no CDP category. Like it is not what it is today. So for the first number of years, if I brought in somebody who was used to this established market and wasn't comfortable with a bit of like an evangelistic type sales approach where you have to convince people that they have problems that they either don't want to acknowledge or don't know how to acknowledge, that's very different than when you're like, okay, the pie has been established and I am fighting for my piece of pie. And there's these types of examples all throughout the organization, but I think that those are 2 that I think will resonate with the audience here.
Yeah, very much. This audience is largely, go to market focused, in addition to being founders and CEOs. So those are dead on.
So I would summarize 4 contextual indicators as to whether someone might be the right fit. 1 is build versus scale. 2 is challenger versus leader. 3 is category creation / evangelism versus a pie divider. And 4 is how much money are they used to working with? I mean, I see this a lot with, so I don't know if that resonates with you, Michael, but I'll say like, I see this a lot with marketing where it's like my example would be, people who work at big companies and with significant marketing budgets, like they're used to just like we're going to get an agency for that, right? It's like anything you're going to like go do, which I probably shouldn't say because I own an agency, but it's like, oh, well, we're going to get an agency. And it's like, we got to rewrite the website. All right, well, we're going to go find an agency and pay them $200K to do that. And it's like, if I worked in-house somewhere, I would just be like, well, why don't I just write the website, right? Like, I'll just do it and it'll be done in like 2 days and then we can talk about it. So I think that's, the amount of money you're used to working with. And I think that speaks to that founder ethos of just like, just do it.
Yeah. Well, I think that to me is more like there are cultural elements of that. Like, is it a throw money at every problem type culture, or is it like, let's fix a process first before we start throwing money at problems? I think that there is a cultural element there, but I do think like that to me falls more into like context. I think the cultural elements, one of the things that I saw going from Interclick to Yahoo, for example, was like we were an execution oriented culture that was go-to-market led, engineering supported. We got to Yahoo at the time, it was basically the opposite. Like the engineers called the shots and the sales team and the go-to-market teams were like effectively second-class citizens, right? Those are like very different types of cultures. You don't necessarily need founder mode to succeed. Like there are companies that have moved beyond that and have embraced full-on kind of like manager mode, right? If you've been in that type of environment and you're used to that and you're not comfortable interfacing with founders, then fine, so be it. But if the culture is such that like it is at mParticle where like I'm involved in a bunch of shit. Why? Because I have to be. If you're not used to that, that's going to be really off-putting, right? And I think like that's where the distinction between just like generally characterizing things as like founder mode versus manager mode. It's like, is there a culture here of freedom and autonomy that works? Or is there founder involvement, right? How does that intersect with the candidate and their experience, right? Because I think knowing how to support and work with founders, like founder CEOs, I don't know a single one that isn't a total pain in the ass. Myself, like very much included. Like we are a difficult bunch to work with because we do have a bunch of views and we have more context than anybody else in the company. And so we're usually like at least 2-3 months ahead of where probably most folks are from a strategy standpoint, from a market understanding standpoint. But yeah, I think the other thing too is like you see, even if we look at big tech for a sec, the kind of cultural undertones of some of these like big companies, like Google's very different than Apple, and that's going to be very different than Netflix, and that's very different than Amazon, right? I think one thing that I've seen, and I call this out in the post, it's like, how do they deal with stress? Because startups are pretty fucking stressful. Not every day, but you guys know it's a bit of a roller coaster. I think that's also why you see like a lot of founders have like their emotional volatility has kind of collapsed into like a very kind of narrow range. But like most people are not, especially people who've never been exposed to that environment, find that really jarring. And then as they're stressed, they're not thinking clearly and they're not going to be as productive as they could, or just generally happy as they could be otherwise. So like those things have a huge impact.
Culture is obviously very individual to the company. So again, going back to how you are hiring execs, right? That, to de-risk cultural unfit, what are some of the things that you're looking for or talking to them about?
I think the first thing is like, you have to work on problems together. When you're hiring executive, like as CEO, founder, whatever, Like you're hiring somebody basically like at your level. And hopefully you're hiring somebody that's so good at what they do, like you can actually learn from them as well, right? Like some of the best hires I've made here and at InterQuick are like, they weren't just like people that worked for me. They were like in a lot of ways like mentors for me. And I think like where I've gone wrong is like, even if I'm doing the exercise of like, okay, let me kind of like strip past the kind of layers of BS that most hiring processes kind of fall into. I think where I've gone wrong in the past is not doing like situational exercises with the executive, right? So present an actual problem, maybe something that's top of mind or something that you faced over the course of the past year. How do they approach that problem, right? Because so much of it is like, I mean, there's obviously no kind of one single way of thinking about things, but you want to make sure that like your brains are compatible. Like the way that you think about problem solving is going to be compatible, because if you have, say, a culture and a belief system that's like very principle driven, it's like, let's figure out like, what are we solving for? What are the kind of core principles before we start launching in? But then you hire an executive who's like a ready, fire, aim type. Like that's not going to work. Right. So you have to start to calibrate like, okay, when I'm in the trenches with them, are they going to be kind of like running around zigzagging, acting very different? Or are they going to be like, is their resting heart rate going to be kind of like the same as mine? And I think that there's a number of things, and I called it out in the post, like just asking for the 30, 60, 90-day plan. It's not enough. Like those are, I think it's a fine exercise just to make sure like it filters out like people who can't do that or don't do it, like it filters out like the bottom. But I don't necessarily think it's overly indicative of like executives who can come in and deliver a whole bunch of upside. It's more about, let's get our hands dirty. Let's actually spend a bunch of time, because if I do hire you, we're going to have to spend a bunch of time. And if we're not on the same page philosophically or how we approach these things, like it's a recipe for disaster. Like resentment will set in, and then you get into like this kind of really bad environment.
Yeah, so culturally, one of the most important things is their decision-making process and orientation to challenges, you might say. You said something at the beginning that was related to that, I think, Michael. You were talking about one of the unique traits of founders being that they tend to have really strong willpower and a sort of ability to impose their will. I think, some people who are critical of the whole founder mode concept, and people who maybe aren't founders and have been, burned by some founders, they might say, that's part of like the mythology of founders. But I want to like break it down into its parts, because I think there are like salient elements to that also can apply to non-founders. It's just a bit less common or a bit less universal, maybe. Like to me, the two big things are risk tolerance / willingness to fail. Like if you started a company from zero, you started with nothing, you might have had a completely different conception of what the company was going to be. You like twisted it around a bunch of different times. Like you're going out there, you're going to F up, people are going to tell you wrong, whatever. And then the second thing would be urgency. Like I think founders bring that attitude of like, again, you were used to working with before you had any funding or a team or whatever, and you just like did stuff. And I think that attitude of like, I'm just going to do stuff is like anathema to some people who are used to like very corporate, like big company environments. But yeah, so those are the two things I would break it down into, but curious what you think.
Yeah. I mean, we can get pretty deep here. Like there's probably an element of like childhood trauma that forces you into like taking risk and a whole bunch of stuff that, like quite frankly, I've kind of come to learn about myself as I've gotten older, gone through therapy and had coaching and all that stuff. I think the other thing is this mindset of like, we are open for business 24/7. Like if something comes up on the weekend, like I'll do whatever it takes whenever it comes up to make sure that we can get this thing done. That's very different than like, no, I punch out at 6 o'clock, my phone is down. Like I respect that. Like, I wish that I could turn my brain off the second I walk into my apartment and switch over to like family mode and dad mode. But like, there's a part of the brain that just kind of keeps turning, right? So, I think that's the other thing. It's like, do you have that mindset of like, we're open for business 24/7?
I have to ask, since you said it, have you figured out through like a lot of the coaching and stuff you mentioned, like what makes founders tick, or what makes you tick?
I think so. Yeah. I mean, there's like the old kind of like VC saying, it's like chips on shoulders, but it's chips in pockets, right? And I think that's kind of corny, but it doesn't mean it's not true. I think that there's a lot of truth to it. And like, for me and my own experience, like the way things ended at Yahoo, well, the way things like everything transpired at Yahoo with like 5 CEO changes and then getting kind of pushed out at the end, it pissed me off. It motivated me to go and prove that we were better than the opportunity that we were given and the amount of credit that we were given for building this like pretty incredible platform. It was kind of like a bit of a revenge tour. And I think that is a powerful motivator for a lot of people. I would say like whatever it is, if it's like you have a chip on your shoulder, you're trying to prove something to your dad who didn't pay enough attention to you, or it's like revenge for the girl that broke your heart, or like whatever it is. I think you also have to recognize that like over the course of time, like those are tools that become kind of blunted, and they stop being as effective. And so you ultimately need to evolve your thinking. Like you can't walk around all day, every day for the rest of your life with a chip on your shoulder. Like at some point it has to be because you love what you do, not that you're trying to prove something to somebody else.
I think it can actually be really hard for people who have that. Like I definitely have that. And I think it can be really hard for us to understand people who like operate from a place of like baseline sort of like contentment, or what like we might critically call complacency. Like I think it's like I've had to learn as I've gotten older, like how to be content, right? But like my baseline level is like, we need to do better. Like this isn't enough. Like,
Totally.
We have to move faster. And there are people who, speaking of the cultural fit, like I have friends who are really smart, but they are just super like security driven and super risk averse, right? And they're just like, and they work for big corporations, and they have since they got out of college, and they always will. And, like that, I think knowing them and like having some more business experiences has taught me about the risk of hiring that big corporation person, because again, they could be really smart. It's not saying that they're not smart, but it's just like those sort of like very rule following, like peaceful people. They're just, you can't transform them into like super risk taking, get shit done, like disruptors.
Yeah. And vice versa too. Like as founders, like we're wild animals, right? Like we are very much feral, and trying to domesticate us in a much more kind of structured, more conservative environment. Usually like you can do it for a period of time, but you can't do it for like 15, 20 straight years. It just like, and that's where I say like context and culture really matters. There's no good or bad. It's just like, is this the right fit for this person at the right time, at the right place?
Beyond context and culture, just, because we have so many founders and CEOs in our world that listen to this, what advice, if anything further, would you give to them as they contemplate, hey, should I be shifting into founder mode if I don't feel like I am already there?
I think the biggest thing that I've learned is the times when I've really fucked up the most is when I've ignored my instincts. So I can't prescribe what to do for any other founder for a whole bunch of reasons, but like if your instincts are telling you like, hey, something doesn't seem right here, and I gotta dive in, and I gotta dive in pretty deep, go do it and don't care about like what the potential perception may be, because I think like if you don't do that and the company doesn't succeed, or it kind of dies on a vine, like what's the perception then? I think that like it is a bit of a kind of coming of age process, but being able to trust your gut and trust your instinct, I think it's something that you have to earn over the course of time, probably through trial and error. But when you can kind of look at yourself and say like, yeah, I've got through some pretty sticky situations, and I've always figured out a way to be okay, or more than just okay, you should trust your gut.
That's actually very prescriptive, and I think awesome, and probably a good place to end. Joe, you agree?
Yeah. Great pod. Thanks, Michael.
Yeah.
Okay, this is awesome. Thank you so much. This is the type of founder mode conversation that should be had.
Totally.
In the meantime, where can people find more about you on the internet?
On the dark web. No, I'm kidding. That was a joke. I'm on X, Twitter, like whatever you want to call it, mkatz0630. I'm easy to find.
Well, Michael, again, thank you so much. This is great. Joe, want to take us home?
Yeah, thanks for listening, everyone. Smash that subscribe button. Eric and I are, founders with chips on our shoulders. We're hungry for your attention and approbation. We need it to survive. All the millions of dollars haven't done it for Eric. He's still hungry, and that's why he's here. So give us a hand.
I need the attention. Bye, everybody.